before our cocktail reception, which we are all looking forward to, but not before we hear from our final panel tonight, or this afternoon. If you are here and you can hear me, can you clap? Okay, if you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. All right, great. My mother was a first grade teacher, so I learned all my quiet audience tricks from her. So thank you again, everyone, for being here this afternoon. And it is my pleasure to introduce our final session for the afternoon, the Global Energy Economy, the events and policies driving production, supply, and distribution. And you are in for a real treat because we have 4 amazing panelists who are going to walk us through this conversation, and I'm sure it's going to be very insightful. So as every good session begins, it starts with a great moderator. And for our session this afternoon, we have Stuart Nance. Stuart is the founder of Hex Strategies, a strategy advisory firm that advises clients seeking to export hydrocarbons from the US to other parts of the world. And he is based in Houston, Texas. Stuart has more than 40 years of experience in various roles in upstream and midstream businesses, and previous affiliations include Catahoula Resources, Reliance Holding, Bill Barrett Corporation, Ultra Petroleum, MCN Investment Company, Torch Energy Advisors is a long list, Stuart, American Pipeline, Meridian Oil, and Texas Oil and Gas Corporation. So obviously, Stuart is well qualified to lead this conversation, and I look forward to hearing from him and the rest of our panelists.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging around, and howdy and welcome to Denver. For those of you who aren't here, including 3 of the 4 panelists and myself, former resident of Denver, but I was reminded walking over here this afternoon that Denver actually should have a new name. I think we should refer to it as Hockey Town, USA, because the Colorado Avalanche won the Stanley Cup, and earlier this year, the University of Denver Pioneers won the Frozen Four in college hockey. So it's great to be back in Denver for me. And I'm going to do 3 things as the moderator today. I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to set a little context. And then I'm going to keep things moving and try to stay out of the way, with a goal to be finished by 5 o'clock so that we can have our evening networking reception. And so bear with us and we'll get through it. First, my job is to introduce the rest of the panelists, and I think we figured out that they're in alphabetical order. So immediately next to me here is Dave Conalongo. Dave is the Senior Vice President of Liquids Marketing and Transportation for Antero Resources. He has the distinction of being the only Denver resident on the panel. Dave has been with Antero since 2014 and has worked diligently and frankly, very effectively at finding markets for the liquid hydrocarbons that Antero produces primarily from West Virginia. Prior to working for Antero, Dave was with Marathon Petroleum Corporation from 2004 to 2014 when he moved to Denver to work for Antero. Dave earned his bachelor's degree in marketing finance from the Ohio State University, and also has an MBA from Bowling Green State University, home of the Falcons. I learned that today. Next to Dave is Praveen Twan. Praveen is Senior Director for Procurement, Materials, and Logistics, or as he calls it, PM&L, for North American operations at Halliburton. He has been with Halliburton since 2007 when he helped start up an international sourcing team in India and has global now responsibilities for supply chain for Halliburton, which include a variety of things which he's going to tell us more about during his presentation. He has also been working with the Halliburton Center for Excellence in Global Supply Chain since 2019. Praveen holds a bachelor's degree from BITS Pilani in India and has also completed the Halliburton President's Leadership Excellence Program at the Mays School of Business at Texas A&M University. And then finally, at the far end is Angela John, who is Director of Innovation for New Energy Ventures at the Williams Corporation. And as part of that job, which is a relatively new role for Angela, she's responsible for creating and implementing commercial strategies for low carbon energy solutions and developing businesses that help Williams customers meet their emission reduction goals. In addition, Angela's team is responsible for Williams' corporate venture capital program, a number of partnerships that they have with innovation labs and universities, and the Williams New Energy Ventures strategy. Prior to joining Williams, Angela spent 27 years at BP, 19 in their global supply and trading organization, most recently working with low carbon and renewable projects, and a considerable amount of time in natural gas liquids. Angela, I was teasing her earlier, she has an MBA from Northwestern University and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Houston. And if we run short on questions, she's going to explain the difference between Shasta the Cougar at the University of Houston and Willie the Wildcat at Northwestern. So with the introductions now completed, let me try to set the context, and bear with me here. As I thought about, how do we frame up this panel and why we're talking about a global energy economy in Colorado and in the context or hosted by COGA, I thought about my previous experiences with this conference. And it turns out every time I start a new job, I come to COGA. The first time was 20 years ago in 2002. I had just taken the job marketing hydrocarbons for Ultra Petroleum, which became a very large operator in the Pinedale Anticline in Wyoming. Probably within 6 or 8 weeks of starting that job, I was here at COGA in 2002. So I'm thinking in terms of a travel back with me to 20 years ago, what was happening at COGA, and then we'll talk about 10 years ago when I had just taken a job with Bill Barrett Corporation, which I'm sure most of you probably remember Bill Barrett Corporation. And imagine that you're there in the room and overhearing conversations that people are having at that time. What is it they're talking about? What are the words that you don't know what they're talking about? And for me, it was helpful to kind of set the context for August 23rd of 2022 and why we're talking about a global energy economy. So if you were with me 20 years ago, the buzzwords were basin-centered gas play. Williams was producing and developing midstream infrastructure in the Piceance Basin and Wamsutter and places like that, as was BP. And we were worried about things like sage grouse, BLM permits, black-footed ferrets. It's kind of funny to think about what we were really worried about 20 years ago in this setting. And I remember COGA was really great about coming together, meeting people, networking. And at that conference, I was introduced to a guy named Porter Bennett, who founded Bentech Energy. And he asked me to help join a multi-client study called Catch the Wave. Catch the Wave was analyzing the pipeline capacity for the entire Rockies region. CIG, Kern River, all the pipelines, and how much capacity is there and how much gas is there in a very systematic, structured way. Because the real challenge that we had was, look, if we're going to develop all this basin-centered gas, we're going to need markets for it, and we're going to need egress capacity to get it out. And so that was the theme that was set for me 20 years ago, egress and basically exporting it out of the region. Because clearly we weren't going to consume all the hydrocarbons that we were going to be producing in the Rockies region. After I talked to Porter, he subsequently recruited guys like Rusty Brazil and Jim Simpson, now of RBN Energy and East Daily Capital, and they've gone on to do great things as well. Now, fast forward 10 years ago, in 2012, I'd just gone to work for Bill Barrett. They were in the midst of transitioning from being essentially a wildcatter. I think we had operations or leases in 8 states at that point, to being basically a pure play in rural Weld County in the DJ. That wasn't obvious to me when I accepted the job, but it became obvious pretty quickly. If you were listening in on conversations at that point, you were trying to figure out what this word Niobrara was and how do you pronounce it. You heard people talking about the Jake well and EOG resources, and we were still thinking about and talking about Gasland and Josh Fox and fracking and what was going on in that context. And again, it was all about Okay, now we've got Rockies Express in service, and we're looking at Ruby Pipeline. And so we've got more egress, more exports, and people were actually starting to talk about LNG exports from the US at that point. So now come forward to today. Where are we on August 23rd of this year? Natural gas prices hit a 14-year high today, $10 per MMBTU. There was an announcement by Freeport LNG that they were going to be delayed in restarting their liquefaction facilities down on the Texas coast, and prices dropped pretty quickly after that announcement was released. But that's a pretty astonishing number. Last week, RBN reported that EIA announced we averaged 5 million barrels a day of crude oil exports in the week ending August 12th. 5 million barrels a day. It wasn't even legal to export crude oil until December of 2014. So we've come a long way, and the real punchline here is we're exporting massive volumes of all sorts of hydrocarbons. LNG, 12 BCF a day, probably going to 17 by mid-2020s, and RBN earlier this week suggested we could see numbers as high as 30 BCF a day of LNG exports from the US. You know, people sort of mocked Rick Perry when he was Secretary of Energy and was talking about freedom gas, but it seems very real today. So with that context, you know, Angela can tell us about propane exports. We export more propane than we consume in the US on an annual basis. And so, look, if we don't have exports and we don't have international markets, we don't have a hydrocarbons industry in this country. We cannot consume all the hydrocarbons that we produce. So that's the context. I've talked longer than I needed to, but let me pass it to Dave for his opening comments, and then we'll have some questions for them as we go through the panel.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at this panel today, and thank you to COGA for the invitation. As Stuart mentioned, I've been with Antero for the past 8 years. For those of you who aren't familiar with who Antero Resources is, we've been in the Denver market for about 25 years, either under the Antero name or under a previous name, Penteco Energy. Our office is downtown, right on the Union Station Plaza. We've been exploring in the Powder River, coal bed methane. We've been in the Piceance, we've been in the Barnett, the Arkoma. And really, as of 2008, our focus has been predominantly in the Appalachian Basin. So for us, that means the Utica in Ohio and the southwest portion of the Marcellus Shale, and in particular, West Virginia. So we have a land position there that straddles both the rich and dry gas windows in both the Marcellus in West Virginia and the Utica in Ohio. We have over 1,100 wells that are online and operating in those two states. We're not even close to halfway done with what we're planning to do in terms of our operations in the land acreage position that we have today. We have focused primarily on rich gas development. So if you look at our revenues, we're about 65% methane. The other 35% is coming from our NGL production and our oil. We have committed approximately 3.2 BCF a day of nameplate processing capacity. Mostly about 99% of that through the MarkWest or the MPLX infrastructure that we have a joint venture with, our midstream entity has a joint venture with. And we have obviously committed to the fractionation for both ethane and C3+ NGLs that comes with that. I think one of the things that makes us an interesting addition to this panel is that we are one of the most active exporters in terms of U.S. producers in this country. So on the NGL side, we have a position on the Mariner East pipeline system. We export about 75,000 barrels a day of ethane, propane, and butane. If you're looking at just producers of U.S. NGLs, that is the largest in our country. And then on the gas side, we have 2.3 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas firm transport that delivers to the U.S. Gulf Coast and to various LNG facilities that we supply feed gas to down there, as well as to the Cove Point facility, where half of the supply for that facility on the East Coast. So we're very active in the export market, exporter of record on the commodities that we're selling into those destinations. And we've seen the importance of what getting infrastructure has meant for our industry, and frankly, the benefits that it's brought to our international customers and the products they've been able to deliver to their customers around the world. So again, really appreciate the topic. I think it's very relevant to what we're seeing, not only in our industry, but in our country right now, and looking forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you. Praveen?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you. Thanks, COGA, for the invite, as well as hello and good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. As Stuart introduced, my name is Praveen Dhawan. I work for Halliburton, take care of their North America supply chain operations. So I'll start with this. Like, we're coming out of almost 24 months of black swan events, be it the pandemic, be it the Texas freeze, China's putting embargo in Q4 of last year, or cuts on power supply to major polluting industries to curb pollution. You look at Russia's invasion on Ukraine and several other black swan events in the interim over the last 2 years. So we live in a very different world from what we started the decade with, or this decade with. So we're faced with a lot of inflationary pressure in our day-to-day lives as we see it in our business. There's talks of a recession lurking around the corner. We have a lot of kind of a polarized political system around the energy policy in the country, which makes wild swings and makes large investments, sustainable investments, very risky. So that's a deterrent for our industry. Then there's talks around, of course, ESG as a topic, which is picking up a lot of steam and a lot of momentum. And that's not just related to Scope 3 emissions for greenhouse gases and SEC kind of enhancing the overall spectrum of what we are going to declare, but it's a much broader topic in a broader sense with respect to much deeper layers of our supply chain needs to be opened up and looked into from human rights standpoint. You look at UK Anti-Slavery Act, you look at the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act on a global basis, not just North America. There's a lot of factors of uncertainty around the whole oil and gas work that we've been doing for more than 100 years. So to sum it up, right, if you look at oil and gas industry, it's no longer the shiny object for people to come out of school as fresh graduates and be a part of the industry. So that brings in additional strain of talent retention, talent acquisition, especially in areas where the skill set is very transferable between industries. Supply chain being one of them. I'm not going anywhere, but just as an example. There's just an overall specter of uncertainty and challenge associated the world we operate in from an oil and gas standpoint. And if all that was not enough, we have a global shortage of every possible input feedstock that we need for bringing a barrel of crude or hydrocarbon to the surface is in shortage. Be it steel, be it electronics, be it chemicals, be it sand, cement, logistics. Overall, there's a lot of strain and shortage from a global standpoint that we've been seeing over here for the last 2+ years. So I think the summary of all what I'm trying to bring to perspective here for the conversation is we have a lot of challenge, a lot of uncertainty, but I do believe that oil and gas industry has been a very critical portion of the energy needs for the world. And I think we are positioned well to be in that position for the foreseeable future, right? Now, obviously, the survival of the fittest is going to be the mantra for how we go about from here to now, because what worked in the last 20, 30, 50 years is probably not going to work in the next 20, 30, 50 years. But at the same time, this is the industry, I think, no better time than to be in this time, to be in the oil and gas industry, whether you're a producer or you're a service provider or you're an employee, because we are just entering a multi-year upcycle. And I think this industry has proven time and again to overcome those challenges and uncertainties with beating all expectations, right? So I think there's light at the end of the tunnel as we see it from a Halliburton standpoint. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, so to speak, or one-size-fits-all kind of approach from a formula for success standpoint. But there's definitely, I think, technology, innovation, digitalization, automation, you have remote operations, right? These are some of the key fundamental strategies from an oil and gas standpoint that I think are going to be the factors for success for how we look at things moving forward. And we do that at Halliburton, we do that every day, and we execute those strategies flawlessly to maximize value for our customers and returns for our shareholders. And we take pride in our identity that we are an oil and gas services company, and we want to be there for the long term. But we'll have to be there in a more sustainable, more responsible, and a more tech-savvy manner, so to speak. Right. So, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Propane. Angela?
Yes, so first I'll start with just a little bit about Williams. I assume most of you know about it, so I'll keep it pretty short. But Williams is an energy infrastructure company. About 30% of the U.S. natural gas moves through Williams systems each day. And we focus mostly on nat gas and NGLs. And my role at Williams, I've only been there 18 months. I joined in January of 21 to help figure out how Williams would meet their climate commitment. Williams made a climate commitment to reduce our emissions by 56% versus 2005 levels and do that by 2030, and to be on a path to net zero by 2050. But we realized that with this change and with the commitment also comes opportunity. And so I am part of a business development group that's focused on how do you create businesses around that journey toward net zero. So that's what I'm doing at Williams today. I did say that we were an infrastructure company, not a nat gas pipeline company, because in my mind, that's the way we need to think, is about how we can use the skills today to pivot to whatever the future will bring. And I love the way you started with these kind of 10-year timeline chunks. I invite everybody in the audience to try to think a little bit about that. Because when you're working on strategy, if you look at the kind of the 3-year timeline, it's going to be roughly the same as what it is today. I mean, you might see some hints and some signposts of change to come. And there are occasionally things that are disruptive that will happen quickly, but those resolve. But big change takes kind of a 10-year horizon. And that's a really difficult time to plan for or to think about. And you know, when we're talking about these 2030 goals, that's a 10-year horizon, and you need to start today to do something to move yourself toward what you want to be as an individual or as a company. Where do you want to be in 10 years? Or as an industry, as a state? I mean, there's just so many ways that you can think of this kind of 10-year horizon. So. Right. Thanks for bringing that up.
You bet.
For Williams, what we've thought of is in kind of 2 categories, and you can go to our New Energy Ventures, Williams New Energy Ventures, the website, and see more details around it. But we are thinking much the same as I heard some other panelists say about what we do today. Like, what are we going to work on today that'll make a difference today, or in the kind of 5-year time range is kind of where I think today is. And that's solar, renewable nat gas, low emissions products and services. And then what do we think about for the future? So that's CCUS and hydrogen. Those are the things we know today that we're going to be ready to explore so we can pivot if that time comes. But we also created this corporate venture capital program that is also in my accountability. Really excited about that, where we can invest in startups that have new ideas and new technologies. And we've invested in both startups that are working on how do we reduce emissions in our operations today, but also in like a hydrogen company that's looking for how could we create hydrogen for the future.
Great. Thank you, Angela. So we're not going to take questions from the audience, but I would invite you to find these folks afterwards, although Dave's indicated he may be rushing off to Red Rocks. But as Angela was speaking, it occurs to me, it's like I want to ask her about the inflation, the IRA Act.
Yeah.
But that's not in the questions that we discussed.
Oh, well, okay.
And so
we can weave that in.
Yeah,
some of it.
So the point is that we do have some questions that we've kind of talked about and reviewed, and I'm going to go through these. And it may be that I ask Dave the first question, and if the other panelists would like to chime in, we're going to do that as well. But I'm going to try not to stray too far off
Okay.
what we've already
Well,
done.
you can ask me about the IRA after, but not about the difference between the mascots, because I'm not gonna do too
Because
good on
that wasn't planned, right? Well, and I do, if hopefully time will allow us, I do want to talk about hydrogen and try to understand,
Sure.
what you guys are working on
Well,
there.
where do
But-
you want to go now?
Yeah, so the first question that we had was for Dave, and it's consistent with what we've already discussed, but give us your take on, okay, we've had a shale revolution, we've now had Russia invade Ukraine, and we've talked about all of these exports of different types. As Praveen very eloquently said, we've had multiple black swan events. I'm not sure what you call a group of swans. Is it a gaggle or anyway? It's not one, it's multiple. But for you, Dave, how will Antero's plans and strategic planning for the future be impacted by all of these things, dealing with all of that uncertainty as you look forward?
It's a great question. When I think about just the latest, geopolitical issues of the last year, I was talking with my son last week. He started as a fourth grader in the Littleton School District, and he told me, he said, "Dad, we've got a new student, and she's from the Ukraine. She doesn't speak English, and her father is still over there, as all men that are 18 to 60 are required to stay to defend the country." And it really makes you realize how things like that, thousands of miles away, can hit home. And we've all seen the benefits of the last 15 years of the shale revolution, right? So, I remember not long after I started my career, the industry talk was around energy security, and I heard that word in the previous panel, and I apologize, I didn't get to hear all of that. We had to go get mic'd up in the back, but that was the catchphrase, energy security, and it was really, accepting the fact that energy independence was a fantasy at the time. We were heading in the opposite direction. We had been through, decades of geopolitical unrest and military actions and wars around the world as a result of that dependence on different regimes. And so we were looking to expand our access to stable, reliable countries. At the time, predominantly it was Canada. It was envisioned, a significant amount would come from Mexico. And you saw for a few years, that start to play out, in particular with incremental crude oil coming from the north. But very quickly, our industry essentially, kind of bailed out our country on that issue. And I think we can all feel pretty proud about the position that we put the United States in over the last 15 years, not just from a national security perspective, but the flexibility it's given us as a country on foreign policy. And that's really a result of all of us in this room and our cohorts. Unfortunately, our friends in Europe haven't had the same shale revolution, and so they've not expanded their diversity of supply and maybe picked the right partners for their energy needs over that same time period. And for a long time, that seemed to be not an issue. And then very quickly, I think we were all surprised after the Olympics to see what was happening. So I think all of us in this room would say, yes, we would like to be, we'd like to be a part of that solution. I think we would welcome the challenge, and we would meet that challenge through our resource, through our workforce. And it makes sense. The United States is the number one place in the world. If you're a buyer of energy, you'd like to come and contract. We've got a very predictable legal system in terms of commodity contracts. And whether or not that's going to be possible, I think, is the real question. So you take a company like Antero, Appalachia is the second largest, or arguably the largest, natural gas resource in the world. And we're asked all the time by analysts, by investors, well, at what price level would you grow your production? And the real answer is it doesn't matter what the price level is, because we can't build another pipeline out of the basin. Right. And so we produce about 35 BCF a day, and the pipes are full. And a lot of the infrastructure that was repurposed to allow us to produce was already in the ground, right? Repurposed and compression expansion projects. Not a lot of new pipe that ultimately got built, but the new projects have run into resistance kind of at every step, and the vast majority of them have been canceled. If you look at whether you were trying to expand compression into New Jersey or New York or a new pipeline into New England, those have all fallen by the wayside. And the irony in that is that those regions at times are importing, foreign LNG to supply their needs. So, here we are with this great resource, and we're not taking advantage of it. More recently, you saw the Atlantic Coast Pipeline get canceled because its developers, kind of deemed it uncompletable, which is shocking to think about. You've spent billions of dollars and you're 2/3 complete laying a pipeline, you just walk away from that investment. And the same thing is going on right now with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So, there's a possibility that pipeline may come online next year. It got some support, from Senator Joe Manchin, but it's not a done deal. There's a lot of wood yet to chop with respect to that. And if that project comes online next year, it's 5 years late. So that may be, if it does come online, the last natural gas pipeline that gets built out of our largest natural gas resource in the world, if the environment around infrastructure doesn't change. On the NGL side, we witnessed it again with the Mariner East project. So, as I mentioned, we're a large exporter on that asset. It was 2 years late, and it really didn't achieve its ultimate full design capacity. All the diameter pipe was not in the ground until 3 years after that. So 5 years late to build a project in existing right-of-way. And I think the interesting piece about Mariner East is if you look at what that pipeline was ultimately going to serve, where are those NGLs going to go? Well, for us, about 1/3 of our LPG goes to countries that are struggling with energy poverty and energy access. So if you don't know what that means, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you're a cashew farmer, you're home, you might be using wood, charcoal, biomass. 3 billion people around the world have access to that for heating or cooking their food and heating their water, and they don't have access to LPG or LNG or the things that we're also accustomed to. Well, the number one cause for fatalities, if you're a woman or child in those regions, is carbon monoxide poisoning and respiratory illness as a result of using those fuels. So that's who benefited from this project, but we faced tremendous resistance in getting it complete. And frankly, I believe that the main reason is that the opposition isn't looking that far down in front of them as to what, who actually benefits from these products. It's not, sure, folks like us in the industry, we all benefit, but it's really our customers that are having, life altering changes. So, as I mentioned, 3 billion people, rely on those outdated, not clean fuel sources.
Solid fuels.
Yeah, and 3.8 to 4 million people die every year from illness because they're using those products. So,
It's a great success story.
we'd like to be a bigger part of that story. If you look on the LNG side, the U.S., we've reduced CO2 emissions 23% since 2005. I think we all know the main reason for that has been we've switched in our country coal to gas for a lot of our power generation. So, we've been a solution here at home. We think if you care about CO2 emissions around the world, you should want to see that same thing happen in other places. And the only way for that to happen is through LNG exports out of the United States. So we ultimately are going to need infrastructure built. We can do more, but without the support from the regulatory agencies, maybe less opposition from those groups recognizing what we're all trying to do, we're not going to be able to.
So you won't plan for growth based on a lack of additional egress capacity?
How do you when it might be 5 years before that infrastructure ever comes
Which
online?
they're going to ask you to underwrite anyway.
Right.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. You guys want to chime in on that question, or would you like me to ask you your question?
No, I'd like to chime in.
Please.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the opportunity that LNG and clean LNG brings to not only Williams, but to the whole industry in North America. I think we have some work to do to tell the story that nat gas should be an authentic part of any energy transition. And I do think that nat gas will stay in the mix, but to make it easier on ourselves, we need to do more to show that we're good operators and that we do the right thing. And we haven't always, as an industry, done that. And I'm so excited to see that Colorado took those early steps and has done a lot to lead in that sense. But there are places, I mean, in Texas that you can drive through, and it's pretty sad to see all the flares and all the energy being wasted. And I understand the economics and why it happens, but we cannot allow the emissions and the wastefulness to diminish the possibility of what we could provide to the world, just like you said. So I've been really excited about that and really worked on it probably over 6 months now at Williams. I know that's not a long time, but we've made some progress. We invested in a company called Context Labs, and what they are going to do is to trace the carbon intensity, so the emissions intensity, both methane and CO2e equivalent, through the whole supply chain. So not just about what is it at the production, but what is it through all of the gathering, processing, transportation, liquefaction, movement on the ships, the whole thing. Like, because we need to have the whole picture. And that's another way that you can optimize. So you can optimize today nat gas around price and location, and I can see in the future we'll also do it around carbon intensity. And that way we can authentically show that there are differences on where you buy the oil and gas from and how you transport it. And then if you do want a net zero product, you can connect that with carbon offsets and get to any kind of carbon intensity that you want. And so if a company wants a net zero product, we can give them to them. We hired a guy that's working on our team that I'm excited about. He worked for a French utility, and the French utility had said, no, we're not going to buy LNG out of the States because we don't believe that it's responsibly produced. And so this is what we need to ensure, that we've got this moment where the world needs the nat gas that we're producing. But let's do what we can to ensure that it stays there by authentically showing how it fits into a lower emissions future.
I would just like to add to Angela's comment real quick. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think both of my colleagues here as panelists, I agree 100% in terms of us being able to prove that we can actually offer the hydrocarbons, nat gas, whatever, to the rest of the world in a more responsible manner, and we can prove it. And from the oil and gas, the OFS side of things, as Halliburton coming in and several others, service providers coming into that space, I think the challenge is on that side of the equation as well, right? How do we make sure that our footprint is getting greener on location? You know, we have several solutions and technologies that we are actually adopting to in terms of you know, heavy and growing presence around the CCUS efforts. Hydrogen is another opportunity I know we were alluding to earlier during our conversation. At Halliburton, we have an initiative very similar called Halliburton Labs. Yep. That's taken off here in the last 4 years. That is basically you know, an incubator of sorts for bringing in entrepreneurs, startups, investors in a kind of a collaborative environment to offer them the Halliburton world-class, you know, facilities, our infrastructure, mentoring, some level of investment, some level of you know, just coaching, so to speak, and try and take those brilliant ideas that small companies have to take them to commercial reality for a cleaner, greener kind of energy footprint, right? So, so I think there's a lot of work still that remains to be done in that area.
Yeah, the Halliburton Labs program is a fabulous program to just promote creativity and innovation in the space.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
So is it sort of outsourcing some of your R&D efforts, or is that a...
No, it's not really outsourcing our R&D efforts. Our R&D efforts are there intact.
Still doing that.
And we're still doing that from a technology acquisition and innovation standpoint. But this is in addition to that, and in addition to looking at what's all out there, and what's all out there that comes out as an idea but doesn't go anywhere because of various factors and the kind of challenges that we're talking on stage here today. How do we take those ideas and we find merit with those and give them some wings, so to speak, right?
Right. Well, and obviously this differentiated commodity that we're talking about, which you're going to be trying to export to customers beyond our borders, starts at the well. And we've all seen these frac spreads that are, you know, we're obviously putting very large frac jobs down these wells, and it starts right there at that location with the operator, with the oil field services company that says, okay, we're going to be able to do this effectively, not only in terms of getting the job pumped, but the costs, and now the carbon intensity as well. I know most of us have probably seen these locations with rows of equipment lined up to try to get the job off. But no, I think that's really an important point, that it's like, okay, it's the French utilities that say, we would buy this product, but we need assurances, authentication, verification, quantification, and not just an operator telling them. No, there's actually a framework to confirm that this is what's being produced, this is how it's being developed, and as you said, Angela, not just at the pad, but all the way through the infrastructure. And you know, of course, we're talking about different companies here, and to be able to get everybody kind of in unison, that's where we're not integrated in the U.S. like other places might be, where you go to Aramco, or that's just an example, where it's one company that can say, all right, we can verify everything throughout the whole supply chain.
Yeah, it'll be a big challenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm really excited about tackling that. And yeah, I mean, and there's so much to learn. I mean, by exploring what your customers want and what they're talking to you about, you can just open up possibilities. So when I first heard that, I said, well, we report our emissions. Like, it's in our sustainability report. We're required to report it to the EPA. Like, you know, they can see it. And they were like, no, we don't trust your information. We don't trust the EPA. I was like, who doesn't trust the EPA? Like, I actually was a little offended. And I learned something that day. Well, she's not, but no, I learned something that day, because I was like, well, why wouldn't they trust it? And so I started researching it, and then I found out that most of the emissions that are reported in our industry are based on factors. And they are factors that were studied for a long time, but it's like you take this piece of equipment and then you multiply it. And somebody here can probably tell me a better way of explaining this so you can help. But they're not measurement, like in the field, current measurement based. They're based on measurements that were done in the past. And so I'm like, oh, well, that's a problem that can be solved. And so that's one of the principles that we're looking on in tracking it through the supply chain, is you'll take the satellite data, you'll take the flyover data from the drones or the airplanes, and you'll take the ground information. And those of you who have an engineering background or worked in measurement, you can imagine that these things are not always exactly match up. Like, you have to do some work to really dig into it and like get it to be congruent. And so we've invested in technology that'll help us do that. And if it's verified on multiple levels, and then you put it in a technology like a blockchain where it's easily visible by anyone who's interested in looking into it, then it doesn't depend on a US certifier. You know, a European certifier or auditor or someone from Asia, anybody can look into it and hopefully see the data in a way that they can understand it and say, yes, we believe in that.
And it's not self-certified.
Yeah, they probably won't believe it. Yeah.
So what about that, Dave? Are you seeing that from folks that you're interacting with in international markets, that they have a desire for a differentiated commodity, that they want to know where it's come from and how it was developed?
You're seeing it to a greater extent on the LNG side, the natural gas side. And obviously, responsibly sourced gas is already, you know, out there in the marketplace, and it's being traded. It has economic value. On the NGL side, I think because of the fact that most of the certifications weren't really beyond the wellhead, NGLs has lagged in that. But as we talk with our customers, in particular the petrochemical companies, are the most interested in that, because their customers, whether it's Coca-Cola or Unilever, they want to buy responsibly sourced plastic to use in their bottling, and so it's important to those customers, and I think ultimately it'll be important to the European market, because you're seeing, whether you're a trading company and you've got a group of banks that you interact with, those banks are a lot more focused on, responsibly sourced, ESG kind of centric portions of industries, and so it's becoming a bigger deal to them just from a lending perspective. But I would say we're probably 6 to 12 months away from responsibly sourced NGLs and certification of that being something that people are talking about in a meaningful way.
You could see where that would be even more challenging to try to track those gallons, of the various products. I'm looking at Angela because I know she's got...
It will be, but it'll be interesting. At Week, I went into a Saudi Aramco booth, and they had a map, as big as the screen behind us, of trying to track the carbon intensity of oil across the world. And, one of the guys in the booth told me, he goes, yeah, that's our intention. We're going to show that our oil, even though it moves all across the world, and our refineries will have the lowest carbon intensity. So even Saudi Aramco on the oil side is looking into this. Yes, a little easier for them to track it because they have, the whole supply chain.
I had a similar conversation with a European producer, and they're looking at a worldwide portfolio, and they identified their Eagle Ford condensate as some of the lowest carbon intensity in that company's portfolio. But if it's feedstock and you're making these derivative products, you want to know where that ethylene came from, and that's going to be very challenging. But I don't think we can just say, no, it's too hard, we can't do it. I think we're going to have to continue to evolve the technology and the reporting and to be able to give them those assurances. But I can see where LNG might be slightly less complex, and it sounds like from what you're describing that
You're already seeing that interest on the LNG side.
So I'm curious, is that a premium product that you're now selling that sells for a premium price, or are you subsidizing it and basically taking a discount to provide that confirmation? It's a little bit of a loaded question.
Yeah, I would say you could do it two ways. I mean, you don't have to, you can generate the credits and have it decoupled from the commodity. So, and I think that's ultimately where the market should go, because that's certainly going to be the most effective way to get value, for that, and for folks to be able to access and get access to, that evidence and that credit. So I think we're starting to see more examples of that in the marketplace. Certainly the blockchain kind of piece as well. Starting to come into view with that. But that's ultimately how I think it'll be marketed.
There have been deals done. They've talked about premiums up to 5 cents per MMBTU, but it's very, very small, like a fraction of a percent.
That was a lot more exciting when gas was $3.
A fraction of a percent of, but I mean, even the number of deals done are just a fraction of a percent of what trades. So I don't think it's relevant. LNG cargoes, they've been net zero LNG cargoes that have combined carbon offsets with it's an estimate of scope 1, 2, and 3 that they typically use that was published by a European agency. But there's been like 20, maybe 25 of those done.
And does that include the shipping as well on the vessel?
Yeah, it's an estimate of it.
Okay. Well, I know LNG, and my personal purview has evolved a lot over 20 years. And, HEC strategies, we're looking at international markets. And the marine industry is a huge source of CO2 emissions. And, we thought ISO 2020 was going to be a big deal, and the low sulfur. It was sort of a non-event, but what we have seen is on the shipping side, there's a tremendous amount of interest in alternative fuels, LNG particularly, but also hydrogen, ammonia, and so it's going to be, if in fact that's where the markets are, that and it's not just LNG, it's NGLs and maybe hydrogen and maybe ammonia and maybe these other things.
Probably all of it.
Yeah, we're going to have to get it to these customers in other places. And yes, it matters what the fuel that's being used to. I don't know if you've seen the roadmap that Japan has announced for ammonia, the 25-year roadmap for ammonia. And it's, anyway, I'm straying a little bit, but it's just sort of fascinating because you can deal with it at the wellhead and with the oil field services, but you're not finished at that point. You just sort of started your journey down the value chain, and I think we can't just say it's too hard, we can't do it, or it's too expensive, or I think we've sort of passed the point where we can say we can't or we won't. It seems that way to me anyway. I'm curious if you guys agree with that.
I would agree. I think we will.
All right, well, let me ask Praveen a question, because you've mentioned black swans and you talked about ESG a little bit. I'm curious because obviously you've got this global perspective, and frankly, some of the stuff you said frightens me. If I need some services or completions, I'd really just like to be able to pick up the phone and call Halliburton and say, please come and do the things that you need to do. But are you concerned that some of the capacity for these materials that you need in order to provide those services have gone too far beyond the U.S. and that some of these strategically important materials aren't being sourced here in the U.S.?
No, I think, first of all, yeah, I would like you to pick up the phone and just call.
Absolutely. Put you on speed dial.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, I think the easy answer to your question would be yes, but I don't think that's the complete answer, right? Because the real answer is more complicated than that. Because if you believe me or not, but every possible country in every economy is facing the same challenge that we're facing right now, whether it's manpower shortage, whether it's supply shortage, capacity constraints, related inflation because of that. So we're all in the same boat, right? Mm-hmm. So we may feel that somebody's got it greener and better than what we have here, but actually that's not the truth, what we see. In many ways, we are much better off in the US because we still have the scale, we still have the muscle to get products, even if it's at a premium. But just to give you an example, for example, ocean freight, we were just talking about vessel, right? Mm-hmm. Ocean freight in the last 2 years has played havoc. Capacities have played havoc. We had a lot of container shortages with stuff held up at the ports here, not able to go back to the point of origin, so it cannot come back with the product into the States. Right. But those challenges were more, I think, just due to the pandemic and the shortage associated with that. It's not something that's going to continue. We're already seeing signs of those leveling off a little bit. Hopefully that trend continues in the coming months. But I think the real answer is, regardless of which, whether we are on the downstream side, midstream side, upstream side, right? Regardless of what segment of the oil and gas industry we're in, I think the companies and the businesses who are able to be analytical and strategic in finding those risks, which are from a supply chain standpoint, 3-4 layers deep, and come up with some strategies to mitigate those risks and effectively execute to those plans, mitigation plans, I think is going to be the answer. Whoever is able to do that in a more sustainable manner and in a repetitive manner and as an ongoing continuous improvement, because as you were saying, right, these things don't take a year or 2 years, it's a 10-year plus cycle, right? For example, even at Halliburton as an example, our strategic supply chain journey didn't start at the start of the pandemic. We've been working at it for over a decade. And we continue to work at it every day in terms of executing to those plans in a very disciplined manner and look at multiple layers and keep peeling the onion in terms of where that risk lies and mitigate that risk. Sometimes it may be at a global level, sometimes it may be at a local level, but that's got to be done in a very systematic and strategic manner on a sustainable basis, right? On a continuous basis. It cannot be a point-in-time exercise and you do that and you're done for the next 5 years. It doesn't work like that.
Great. Well, I'm looking at the clock here, and I would love to continue this, for the rest of the evening, but we don't have that kind of time. So, Angela, I want to follow back and talk a little bit about CCUS and hydrogen.
Sure.
And what you're doing with Williams, and then ask the other panelists if they'd like to weigh in as well. That's not really a question, but I'm doing that sort of by intention to let you kind of take us where you'd like to take us with that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I think hydrogen and CCUS are both things that we need to look to for the future. And I'm really fascinated by the opportunity that both these things could create a lot of scale. Hydrogen has really interested me in the matter of providing thermal energy for heavy industry. and then for storing renewables when it's not needed in the grid, like providing stability and storage. But then when you think through that, and I know we have a lot of people from Moxie here and had them on the panels before, direct air capture could really interrupt that need to use anything other than nat gas or oil and gas for that thermal energy. Because if you figure out direct air capture and get it to a price that makes sense, then oil and gas plus air capture or sequestration, like CCUS, you need to levelize these things. So some of you may have heard of the levelized cost of electricity. I like to look at the levelized cost of energy, and then you add in, but it needs to be clean, not just clean, but reliable as well. So let's look at all of it. So if you take gas and add CCUS to it, how does that compare to adding something to get reliability for the solar or wind? And what would get that reliability? A breakthrough in batteries. And so you could see that either of these two things, a breakthrough in battery technology or a breakthrough in the cost around CCUS, really can make a difference in whether hydrogen picks up or not. And so it's a fascinating place for where we positioned it at Williams. Is it's a place that we will explore and we will look at, and we'll be ready to pivot when the time's right. And for us, we haven't figured out that the time's right yet, but we are investing in projects in the meantime, because that's how you will get the innovation that's needed and the efficiencies and the breakthroughs, is by doing something. Like if you just sit and wait, we won't ever get there. So we are looking at hydrogen production projects. We are looking at CCUS. Those are primarily around our gas plants. We have projects in the pipe. They're not ready to be announced at this point, so I can't say a lot about it. But I'm excited that we are doing something today. It's not at a big enough scale to do what the world needs by 2030 or 2050, but it's a start where you start like getting momentum. And on the corporate venture capital side, I've learned so much around that. We did do an investment in turquoise hydrogen. So has anybody heard of turquoise hydrogen? Oh, somebody has, so it's quite a few. Yeah, so green hydrogen is typically done by electrolysis, and you need to use renewable power and you need water, so to create the hydrogen from the water. Blue hydrogen is when you create it from nat gas and then you sequester any of the carbon dioxide that comes from it, and that's blue. Turquoise is using microwave technology to drive methane pyrolysis, so that's without water or oxygen, so that you create hydrogen and solid carbon. And we believe that the solid carbon can be sequestered in an easier way. So we invested in a startup that's working on turquoise hydrogen. Now, to continue the rainbow, pink hydrogen is hydrogen made from nuclear. And I learned a new one from another startup that I was talking to, gold hydrogen. It's a brilliant name, but their gold hydrogen is the idea of actually putting microorganisms into depleted oil and gas wells that will essentially metabolize the leftover oil and gas and create hydrogen, CO2. You take the CO2 out, put it back into the ground. I mean, I don't know if it'll work yet, but wouldn't that be great if that? So it's just a great place, to explore, to see what the future will hold when we look that 10 years out.
Great. So Dave, are you guys looking at CCUS projects at Antero?
Well, I'd say, first of all, I just learned a lot from what Angela just shared with us. We're keeping an eye on those things. I mean, we don't have maybe the size or the scale. I think that you need to do a tremendous amount of research in those down those avenues. So we appreciate Williams and the folks that do to look at those solutions for the industry, and ultimately we would see application to that to ourselves if and when they become commercially viable.
Got it. And Praveen, is Halliburton preparing to provide services for folks that want to actually? I mean, there's some wells that are going to need to be drilled and cemented, and a lot of observation and modeling that these MRV plans are going to need
No,
I
absolutely.
assume you guys are right in the midst of all of that.
We are right in the middle of that. In fact, as we speak in this basin, we have active work going on around geothermal, hydrogen, a lot of plug-in abandonment work. There's a lot of growing presence that we have on the CCUS side with the carbon transportation and storage side of things that Halliburton is engaged in. I think it's a growing area, right? And we are all in our early stages trying to figure out which one is going to be a more sustainable solution for it. So everyone's experimenting, looking at new things. But at the same time, I think it's a very interesting and great opportunity to really, bringing the message back into, right, as I said earlier, I think this is the industry, no better time to be in this industry than now. And with so much of interesting stuff that's happening from a technology standpoint, that is the area that will take us to the next level and make energy in a more sustainable fashion, in a more responsible fashion, whether it's coming out of natural gas or crude or whatever form of hydrocarbon we look at. I think that's going to be the crux of the matter.
Well, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention oil fields as pore space. We've been flooding, Oxy and others can tell you, Denbury, we've been flooding oil fields in the Permian Basin for 50 years, and the best place to put CO2 is where you've already pulled some oil out. And I know that the IRA provides for more lucrative credits, so hopefully we'll see lower carbon oil production as well, and I think that's beyond the scope of our panelists, but I feel like we ought to at least say that out loud, that if you think about primary production getting 10 or 15% of the oil in place and water flooding gets about the same, and now you're going to put CO2 in and dramatically enhance the recovery of the proven existing hydrocarbons with all the infrastructure already there, to me it seems like a no-brainer. And maybe I'm biased, but hopefully we'll see and hear more about that in future days. With there's a tremendous resource that we should not just walk away from.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's holding all of this back, is that it's expensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive.
Absolutely.
And so we need the government support to drive, if that's the way that we're intending to move forward. And that's how it ties right back into your comments about the IRA. But replacing the current infrastructure that's in the ground today, or wherever, the current infrastructure that delivers energy to the world today, replacing that would be very wasteful to not use it.
Right.
And to replace it would create a lot of emissions in the world too. So you really want to use everything that's already been there. You don't want to abandon this stuff, but do it in a way that is authentic about, we can also do this and we can meet our climate commitments as well if we get the right breakthroughs.
Well, I find myself sort of wondering, like, should we really be incentivizing direct air capture? And I know we need to advance the technology. It seems like to me the more lucrative credits should be going into the oil fields, but that's probably a little self-serving. But anyway.
Well, I think you need both, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I see we've got 4 seconds left, so I'm going to say we're done. I want to extend my thanks to all the panelists, and if we could give them a round of applause. So I'm supposed to pass it back to Sarah, and she's going to tell us where we go for the executive networking reception.
Yes. So, Stuart, thank you so much for so skillfully navigating that conversation. I learned so much every year at the Energy Summit. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, everyone, for staying with us for the afternoon. Indeed, we are going to adjourn, and the networking reception is going to be in the Bonfils Theater lobby, so it's the same place that you came in. Just a reminder that if you have a moment to just do the session surveys for the sessions that you attended this afternoon, that would be wonderful. And if you run into one of our sponsors at the reception, please thank them. We are able to host an event like this in a beautiful facility like this because of the generous support of our sponsors. So say thank you to them and enjoy your networking reception.